be carriers. We don't have a lot of them anymore because it's pretty rare to be exposed to the organism. But back in like 1700s, 1800s, it was very prevalent. So a lot of people were probably chronic carriers. And that's one of the things that enabled it to cause so many deaths.
I have a question. Like when a doctor says you have bacteria in your gut, which one does it usually, what could that possibly be?
What do you mean bacteria in your gut?
Like you have pain in your stomach and all that type of stuff like that.
Well, everybody has bacteria in their gut, so I'm not sure. Could be some of these, the ones we're talking about. So you've got one of the more pathogenic strains in your gut, and then you might suffer some pain or discomfort, fever, whatever. But everybody has lots of bacteria. They used to actually think that urine was sterile, and we know today that's not true. Urine has a lot of microbes in it. Not necessarily all dangerous, but it has a lot of microbes in it. It's not sterile. So the human body has tons of microorganisms on it. Salmonella cholera suis is something you get from swine. And then Salmonella enteritis is the one that's usually associated with food contamination. Like the peanut butter we were talking about the other day, weren't we talking about that?
Yeah.
Parnell peanut butter? Yeah, that was Salmonella enteritis that was actually in the peanut butter. And that's the one that's in a lot of food recalls, is the Salmonella enteritis. With typhoid fever and Salmonella, it attacks the small intestines. So it actually attacks the microvilli. You get bloody diarrhea, usually associated with Salmonella. It actually attacks and degrades the gastrointestinal tract, so you can get perforation. Usually you don't see that with Shigella. With Shigella, it attacks the large intestine, so you don't usually get the bloody diarrhea with Shigella. The animal salmonelloses, this one is sometimes referred to as enteric fevers. A lot of people have gotten sick from handling things you wouldn't really think about, like dry dog food, for instance. A lot of dog foods, pet foods, are not processed quite the same way that people foods are. And there have been cases where people have gotten salmonella from handling dry dog food and then not washing their hands after and putting them in their mouths or contaminating something that they consume. Salmonella is what we worry about with pet turtles.
Lizards.
Turtles carry salmonella. Bearded lizards carry salmonella on their skin. So a lot of kids have gotten salmonella that way. For a long time, you couldn't even buy pet turtles in a pet store. They stopped selling them for fear of salmonella. I think they're selling them again now. But for a long time, you couldn't get them. Most people get salmonella from chicken. That's why you don't ever want to eat undercooked chicken. You want to be sure that stuff is completely done and pulls away from the bone. Because if not, the salmonella lives in the flesh of the chicken, so it could have salmonella in it. Eggs can have salmonella in them, and it's not a question of the egg being dirty, having feces on the outside. The salmonella gets into the egg before the shell is formed. So that's why they tell you not to eat raw cookie dough or things that have eggs in it that you're not cooking, because there's always a risk that there could be salmonella present if it's not cooked. So, cattle, produce, rodents, reptiles, animal, dairy products, all of those can be contaminated with salmonella. Shigellosis causes or is incapacitating dysentery. The organism, there's a number of different species that cause dysentery. I've always wondered if Chef Boyardee knows about that. But we work with a lot of these guys. We work with Shigella sonii, we work with Shigella flexneri in the laboratory. Did you have a question?
What's dysentery?
Dysentery, diarrhea.
Okay.
Yeah, diarrhea. incapacitating diarrhea. Yeah. But again, with this one, you usually don't get perforation, so you don't get the bloody diarrhea with this one like you do the salmonella. And that brings us to Yersinia pestis. So this is what causes the black plague. You can get plague from domestic animals as well as wild animals. Sylvan means wild. So sylvan would be like from raccoons, things like that. Domestic, of course, usually dogs are the organisms that we worry about Yersinia pestis with. About 200 different species of mammal actually carry the disease, and it's usually spread by fleas. So flea bites an infected animal and then turns around and bites you. That's how it gives you the disease of plague. The flea is actually part of the life cycle of the organism. In the flea's body, the organism replicates, it multiplies, and then it migrates to the flea's esophagus and literally chokes it off. So it squeezes it shut. So the poor flea is starving to death. And that causes the flea to bite and bite and bite and bite, trying to take in the blood meal. But every time he bites, he's inoculating the bite site with Yersinia pestis. So the organism actually changes the behavior of the vector and makes him bite and bite and bite and bite. But every time he bites, he's spreading the organism that causes disease. One of your questions asks you about the infectious dose. So the infectious dose is between 3 and 50 individual cells. So that's what it takes to give you the black plague. One of your other questions asks you about the 3 types. So there's bubonic plague, septicemic plague, and pneumonic plague. Have you ever heard anybody refer to an injury in a child as a bobo, or a bubo, or a boo-boo?
Yeah.
That comes from the black plague. Okay, the bubonic plague is where the organism enters where the flea bites, and it's picked up by the lymphatic system, and it's carried to the lymph nodes. You remember lymph nodes are in concentrated areas around the body. So one of the common places is in the groin or in the axillary region. And the lymph nodes will actually become necrotic and swell. So you get this big, nasty, black-looking sore. So that was a bubo. Okay, and it's kind of gone down in history and been handed down, simply meaning an injury of some sort. So that's bubonic plague, is where you get it by a flea bite. Septicemic is where it migrates into the bloodstream. So you've got bacterial growth in the blood, and that's what triggers that widespread intravascular coagulation.
Oh, I'm sorry, what does that ID stand for again?
Infectious dose. That's the number you need to cause an infection. And lastly, pneumonic is where you breathe it in. So that's where it's localized to the lungs. So a person who has the organism in the lungs, every time they're speaking, they're talking, they're coughing, the organism is coming out of them. And then if you're nearby, you will breathe that in and you can come down with plague. Black plague is a deadly disease. It still occurs. We have black plague popping up all the time out west. Because it's harbored in the prairie dog population. Several years back, there was a couple, an older couple, that was going on the trip of a lifetime, a vacation to New York City, and they were supposed to stay like 3 weeks or a month. Right after they got to New York City, he fell ill and was put in the hospital. Shortly after, she fell ill and was put in the hospital. And they both were determined to have the black plague. And the big fear was, oh my God, it's a bioterrorist attack. You know, somebody's releasing the black plague in the subway, the hospitals are fixing to be overrun, you know, we're gonna have this horrible situation on our hands, and everybody was in a panic. What they finally figured out was this couple had gotten bitten by fleas before they left home. So they actually had the black plague on their ranch. and they had been bitten before they left home, and they didn't get sick until they got to New York City. So those were the only 2 cases that they actually had. But in those cases, I think he lost both of his legs, and I don't think she lost any limbs as a result of it. I think it took a little longer to diagnose him, because he was the first one that got sick, so it had progressed a lot further, and he lost both of his legs as a result of having the infection. And that's that lipopolysaccharide. When you get that widespread intravascular coagulation, it occludes the blood flow. There's a point where there's nothing you can do other than cut it off, amputate.
And all 3 of these are caused from Yersinia pestis.
Pestis, and the organism that causes black plague is Yersinia pestis. So these are the different types of plague. One of your questions asks you about the different species of Haemophilus and the diseases that they cause. I did want to at least mention Pasteurella multicida. You ever heard anybody say, "Oh, let the dog lick it, dog's mouth is cleaner than ours"?
Yeah.
It ain't so. And this is one of the main reasons is Pasteurella multicida. Probably about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a little boy in England that developed meningitis, and they put him in the hospital, they never could get on top of it, and he ended up dying. And at autopsy, they found that the meningitis was caused by Pasteurella multicida, and they traced the infection back to the family cat. So the cat actually carried the organism in his mouth. And he obviously licked a scratch or a wound or something like that, and the little boy developed meningitis and died as a result of it. So dogs and cats can both carry this organism, Pasteurella multicida, in their mouths. So you don't ever want to let animals lick wounds. It's probably not a good idea to let them lick them, period. But you definitely don't want them to lick scratches and wounds and things like that. So we've already said all that. Haemophilus influenza can cause acute bacterial meningitis, one of the main things that causes meningitis. It can cause epiglottitis. That's where you're in the epiglottis, the little flap in the back of the throat that separates the air passage from the food passage. That will swell to the size of a golf ball or larger. So it will literally occlude the passage of air, and the patient can suffocate. Otitis media is an ear infection, sinusitis, inflammation in the sinuses. All of those can be caused by Haemophilus influenza, pneumonia, bronchitis. Whereas a vaccine called the Hib vaccine, y'all familiar with the Hib vaccine? Everybody should be getting their children the Hib vaccine. Hib stands for Haemophilus influenza subcapsular type B. That's what the Hib vaccine protects against, is Haemophilus influenza subcapsular type B. And it works very, very well, as you can see here. When they introduced the vaccine, the numbers just plummeted. There's always a little bit background, but nothing like there was before we had a vaccine. Haemophilus aegyptius causes conjunctivitis or pink eye. A lot of things can cause pink eye. Strep can cause pink eye. Staphylococcus can cause pink eye. But one of the main causes is Haemophilus aegyptius. Haemophilus ducreyi causes cancroid sores. It's a type of a sexually transmitted disease. And then Haemophilus parainfluenza and Haemophilus acrophilus are normal oral and nasopharyngeal flora, and they can cause infective endocarditis if they get into the bloodstream. Okay, so that was 20. So moving on to 21. So these are the ones that are unusual, still gram negative, but these are the ones that have unusual shapes, like the spirochetes. They're ones that look like coiled springs. So we're going to look at the treponema, the leptospira, and the borrelia. Now there are lots of these that are free living that don't cause any disease. Now lots of ones besides the ones we're going to talk about. We're just mainly going to focus on the human pathogens. So these live in the oral cavity, the intestinal tract, perigenital regions of humans as well as animals. Treponema is what causes syphilis, specifically Treponema pallidum, subspecies pallidum, causes syphilis. It's very difficult to grow. You have to grow it in cells. We don't have any artificial medium that the organism will grow in. Humans are the only natural host, and everybody knows that's a sexually transmitted disease, and it's capable of crossing the placenta. There's a really good movie out there about the syphilis experiment. Everybody know the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? Most people have heard of that. Kind of a dark day in scientific history. There's a really good movie out there about that. Now, there are lots of movies and lots of documentaries, but I thought this one was really well done, if you're interested in that. The stages of syphilis, primary syphilis, secondary, and tertiary. In primary, that's when you see the sore. So the organism attaches to the epithelia and triggers that lesion, and the lesion weeps. It's real wet, and all that fluid is just teeming with little treponemes. So any contact with that fluid is infectious, so you could get syphilis that way. That will heal on its own without any treatment, and if a person didn't know any better, they might think, oh, I'm fine now. But that is not the case, because what will happen is it will move into the bloodstream. That's when you see the secondary syphilis symptoms. So quite often the rash will develop. You'll actually see the rash on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, which is kind of an unusual place to have a rash. But that will go away without any treatment whatsoever. And if a person doesn't know any better, they might think they were just fine now. But then later in life, they'll develop tertiary symptoms or tertiary syphilis. So that's when you see the gummas, the lesion on the nose. You'll notice the pupil here has an odd shape. Most people's pupillary opening is round. Well, in tertiary syphilis, it actually changes the shape of the pupillary opening. That's called the Robertson-Ardile pupil, I believe, where you get that odd shape. You ever see the movie Venom with Stephen King? Yeah. The Gypsy King had a gumma, you remember? Yeah. And it was very well done. It looked real. That's another good movie. Congenital syphilis is where the disease is passed from the mother to the unborn child. So it actually crosses the placenta. After the baby's born, you'll have nasal discharge, skin eruptions, bone deformation, nervous system abnormalities, and this is called Hutchinson's teeth. The teeth are really, really thick, and they've got like a concave bottom to them, so they're like dented in all along the base of the tooth. I guess that's the tip of the teeth. That's probably, the Tuskegee experiment was horrific, just, considering the men that were affected. But even more tragic to me is all of the women that got syphilis from their husbands because the husbands weren't being treated. And all of the children that suffered because the father had syphilis and then they got congenital syphilis. So that to me is just terribly, terribly sad. This sign was actually right outside Foley, Alabama in 2011. Did y'all know that we had a major syphilis outbreak in South Alabama?
In Foley?
There have been major syphilis outbreaks all across the United States. It's really made a comeback. So they put these billboards up trying to educate people what the symptoms are, encouraging people to go and be checked and be treated if necessary.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So with Tuskegee, did they use humans as a host because they couldn't grow it and they just wanted to study it?
No, it started out innocently enough, okay? Because we didn't have a cure. Remember, penicillin wasn't even discovered until the early 40s. So when the Tuskegee experiment started, there was no cure. There wasn't anything you could do to stop the infection. So the government wanted to know what the long-term effects of the infection would be. So they simply started to follow these men. very poor area of Alabama, you know, very little health care. So anything at all was looked at as a blessing. You know, they were getting any attention, any treatment whatsoever. The real tragedy came in the early 40s when we had treatment. But these men were not only not given the treatment, they were denied getting it from any other source. There are stories about them getting in line to get on a bus that was run from Atlanta into South Georgia and South Alabama, picking up people that needed medical treatment that didn't have access to it, and they would take them back to Atlanta and try to help them. So there are stories about men getting in line to catch that bus, and Nurse Evers actually pulling them out of line and preventing them from going and getting treatment, telling them that everything that could be done for them was already being done for them. And it went on into the 70s, I think. When was Clinton in office? That was the early 2000s. President Clinton actually made a formal apology, and there was some economic recourse. I'm not sure what it was. Whatever it wasn't enough. But the survivors and the families of the survivors, yeah, they got some monetary relief, but whatever it was, obviously it wasn't enough. Okay, leptospira causes leptospirosis. We're gonna focus on leptospira interrogans. That's the one that's zoonotic. Rodents carry the infection and they shed the organism in their urine. Y'all remember, y'all probably saw it, there's been a story that's gone around the internet several times about a woman in Texas who was on a boat and she drank out of a Coke can and came down with leptospirosis. And the idea was that a rat had peed on the can in the warehouse, and it persisted on that can until she drank from the can, and then she got the infection that way. That's very unlikely for that to happen. That's probably not true. Now, that's not to say washing cans is not a good idea. It is a good idea, especially cans. You know, you're opening can openers and things like that. But you really don't know. You know, dust and different stuff might be on the outside. But it's very unlikely that somebody got leptospirosis that way. Leptospirosis is pretty rare in the contiguous 48. It's mainly seen in Hawaii, Texas, and Florida, more tropical-like regions. Wild pigs get it, and it's become a real problem in dogs. There's usually a vaccine. You have to ask your vet for it. It's not something they give to them automatically, but you can get your pet vaccinated against leptospirosis. Your book says 50 to 60 cases. It's probably closer to 100, 250 cases every year, with most of those being in Hawaii. You'll see that petechial rash with leptospirosis again because it is a gram-negative and it has that lipopolysaccharide. So you'll see that rash with that organism as well. Borrelia. We're going to focus on Borrelia hermsii and Borrelia burgdorferi. Borrelia hermsii causes relapsing fever. Squirrels and chipmunks carry that one. It's transmitted by ticks. So if a tick bites an infected animal and then bites you, that's how you get it. This is another one that has that undulating fever pattern. Because it changes its coat on a regular basis, so you get that repeating fever, the patient gets better, and then you get the fever again, and so on and so forth. Borrelia hermsii is carried by soft ticks. You know, the ticks that bite your dog and swell up like grapes. Those are argacid ticks. Those are soft ticks. So that's the organism that carries Borrelia hermsii. Borrelia burgdorferi is carried by hard ticks. So these are hard ticks. You ever pull a tick off of it and it's got that little white dot on it? That's a Lone Star tick. Lone Star ticks, black-leg ticks, brown ticks, all of those carry Lyme disease or can carry Lyme disease. It's a very slowly progressing disease. It mimics a lot of other things, so quite often it's misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. If a person carries it a long time, they can have cardiac issues, neurological symptoms, polyarthritis. A lot of people get that bullseye rash associated with an infection, not everybody, but that's one of the telltale symptoms that you'll see associated with Lyme disease is that bullseye rash.
Can you go back to one slide? The other one. So the residue for that one is mainly.
Squirrels and chipmunks.
That's the one for these.
It took a while to figure out how Lyme disease spread so far so fast. It's called Lyme disease because it was first identified in Lyme, Connecticut. But now it's all up and down the eastern seaboard. Scientists finally figured out that it's the migratory birds, the songbirds. So the ticks hitch a ride, basically, and they bring the Lyme disease with them. So that's how it spreads so quickly all up and down the eastern seaboard. The Ixodes tick, this the blackleg tick, the first feeding form is this one here, and you can see it's not much bigger than the D on a dime. So these are very small ticks, very easy to miss. We used to think that if you went out and got a tick on you, if you looked yourself really well and got it off immediately and didn't leave it on for a day, you were probably fine because it took a while for them to transfer the organism from the tick to you. Now we know that's not true. They can actually infect you with the disease within hours. So it doesn't take 24 hours of them being attached to actually make you sick. The curviforms, these are like little comma-shaped bacteria, so we're going to look at Vibrio, Campylobacter, and Helicobacter. Vibrio cholera, that's what causes cholera. Okay. The toxin is the L-Tor biotype toxin. It interferes with resorption of water in the large intestine, so water just goes straight through. So a person can get cholera in the morning and be dead that afternoon. And they could lose 10 liters of fluid, 12 liters of fluid a day. And obviously, you can't drink enough to compensate for that. So you have to be where you can get intravenous fluids in order to survive. And most areas of the world where cholera is still a problem don't have access to that kind of medical care. So a lot of people die from cholera every year. Excuse me. Vibrio parahemolyticus and Vibrio vulnificus are both associated with seafood. Parahemolyticus is from raw seafood, like in ceviche. Y'all know ceviche, where you put raw seafood and lemon juice on it? And I've had people tell me this before. Well, the lemon juice cooks it.
My brother-in-law's from
No,
Guam. Yeah.
The lemon juice denatures the protein. It looks cooked,
Yeah.
but it is not cooked. And if there's a parasite or a bacterium in there, that lemon juice is not going to do anything to it. So when you consume that raw seafood, you're consuming that parasite or that microbe. So a lot of people get sick that way. Vibrio vulnificus is the one that's usually associated with raw oysters. So you don't want to eat raw oysters. That's why they tell you not to eat raw oysters in certain months.
You talking about,
They think so.
you talking about like straight out of the shell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got no people that do that.
Yeah,
I like oysters.
would-
I like seafood, but I don't care. I like it. I
Yeah,
like sushi.
it's
I like a
really
lot of raw things.
It's nasty, first of all.
To you.
You feel like throw up in your mouth.
No, it don't.
Vibrio vulnificus has become much more prevalent in Gulf waters. We're actually seeing a form of necrotizing fasciitis that's caused by Vibrio vulnificus now. It's very common in the Gulf waters.
Do you think it's because it's warmer there now than it used to be?
It's warmer, yeah, and also think about the number of golf courses. the amount of fertilizer they put on lawns and golf courses and all that washes right in the ocean. And all that causes the microbes to increase in number. So that's why you see so much of it now, and that's why so many more oysters are at risk.
Oh.
And in this necrotizing fasciitis, the organism gets in through a wound or a cut or something like that, and then you get necrotizing fasciitis. This one really has only been in the literature for about the past, 5-10 years. With Vibrio vulnificus, now the latest numbers I had were from 2013. 41 people got it just through contact with the Gulf water, and 25% of those people died. So it's a pretty serious infection. And that's Vibrio vulnificus, the same one that's associated with raw oysters. Campylobacter is usually associated with chickens, turkeys, fowl, things like that. Campylobacter jejuni infects the jejunum, and Campylobacter fetus is the one that pregnant women have to worry about. This one burrows through the mucus and multiplies in the last segment of the small intestines, hence its name, jejuni. It has a toxin that's very similar to the cholera toxin. So it gives you that diarrhea just like cholera does. You got headache, fever, abdominal pain, and then that watery diarrhea. And then fetus actually attacks the developing fetus and can cause meningitis, pneumonia, arthritis, septicemia. Helicobacter is actually a gastric pathogen, so it lives in your stomach. This one was first discussed in the literature back in 1979 as the cause of ulcers. What do we think caused ulcers up to that point?
Spicy food.
Stress. People got stress. So, person had ulcers, you told them to distress their life, eat a bland diet, and they'd be just fine. Well, in '79, we proved that was not correct. So the two researchers, I believe, were Barry and Marshall, that thought that this organism was responsible for causing ulcers. So the way they went about proving their theory was, I think it was Barry. He underwent endoscopy, where they go in and they look around to make sure you don't already have ulcers. Then he drank a solution of Helicobacter and waited. And sure enough, he developed ulcers as a result of that. And then he was treated with antibiotics and he was fine. But they actually won the Nobel Prize
I'm
for
gonna
that.
ask you that. I
Yeah,
remember
they
that
won the
story.
Nobel Prize.
Where was the ulcers? Where were they formed?
Huh?
Where were they formed?
In the stomach. It's in the stomach. 90% of stomach and duodenal ulcers are associated with Helicobacter. People with blood type O have a much higher incidence of carrying the organism, which is interesting, and I don't know why that is, but they are much more likely to have ulcers and carry this organism than the other blood groups are. This is an organism that makes the enzyme urease. Remember, urea, let me get the black one.
So is this going to be the only cause for ulcers? Or
There
is
are
this-
other causes, yeah, this is just one of the more prevalent
Compounded by-
ones, right.
They grow in different places, you know, right?
Oh, yeah.
Miss McCullough,
Uh-huh.
how acidic is our stomach? Like, is there something you can do to make your stomach too acidic to pick that up?
Well, your stomach acid, I think, is around a pH of 1 or 2, something like that. So it's about as
Acid is gonna
acid,
get.
yeah, but it's designed to be an acid environment.
Yeah.
So the stomach lining is constantly replacing itself. The way the organism survives is it breaks down urea. So remember, urea looks like that, and the enzyme urease cleaves those bonds right there. So the amino groups are reduced to ammonia. And ammonia is a very powerful base. So that neutralizes the stomach acid. So that's how it survives in the stomach. Now, taking things like, what's that purple pill that a lot of people take for indigestion? Nexium? That actually puts you at greater risk because that already reduces the acidity in the stomach. So that puts you at greater risk for picking up the organism as well as some other stuff too. So that's how it makes a living in the stomach. Okay, the last few are unique. We've mentioned these guys before, actually. The Rickettsiaceae, the Chlamydiaceae, and the Mycoplasma. So both of these, the Rickettsia and the Chlamydia, are intracellular pathogens. So they actually live inside of other cells. The Rickettsia are spread by arthropod vectors, things like fleas, ticks, lice, things like that. And everybody knows how chlamydia is spread, right? It's a sexually transmitted disease. We believe that chlamydia, this is really interesting, we believe that chlamydia were once free living in the environment, but once they started to be spread sexually, sexual transmission has been so successful for them, they've lost their ability to be free living. So now they're only found in the genital tract, and they're only spread through intimate contact. So they used to be free living, but they can't make it on their own anymore. They're destined to be sexually transmitted.
So how did it start being where it came to that point?
When, you know, Mother Nature is very conservative. She's gonna find the path of least resistance. If something works really well, that's the path the organism is gonna take. So being sexually transmitted really simplifies the organism's life, right? So they don't have to worry about making a living in the environment anymore.
So was it maybe like ingested or was like a genital area exposed to?
Yeah, exactly. It became inoculated, then it became colonized, and now it's simply spread from person to person, and that's the way it makes its living.
That must have been rapid in terms of like evolution, right?
Pretty rapid, I'd say. I don't know, you know, we don't have records for the incidence of chlamydia back in the 1800s, 1700s, because there weren't many people then, but, you know, it had to be pretty quick, yeah. And then the mycoplasmas are those guys that lack a cell wall, so they don't have any shape because they don't have a cell wall to give them a shape. So the Rickettsiaceae, that's like what causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And it's called Rocky Mountain spotted fever because that's where it was first described, as Rocky Mountains, but we have it all over the eastern seaboard. They get that telltale spotted rash, that's why it's called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Bartonella is another Rickettsia. Y'all ever heard of cat scratch fever? A lot of people think it's an old wives' tale, but there really is an organism that causes cat scratch fever. It's actually carried on the nails of the cat, and if they scratch you, they'll introduce the organism into the wound, and that's how you get cat scratch fever. Everybody's heard of trench fever, right? Back in the First World War and the Second World War, where soldiers were literally fighting in the trenches. A lot of them came down with a bacterial disease. That was another Bartonella species, and that's what's in the history books is trench fever. So that's actually a bacterial infection that was spread from person to person. Chlamydia, everybody's familiar with the sexually transmitted disease, but one of the worst things that can happen is if the baby's carrying the infection and they don't know, and it gets in the baby's eyes and the baby's not treated. I think today, you know, all babies are treated with a prophylactic just as soon as they're born, just in case the mother is carrying the infection. They're going to stop it at that point and not take that chance of letting that inclusion conjunctivitis occur. And then the mycoplasmas, you don't see that a lot in people, because it's an atypical pneumonia. That's mainly a problem in the animal world. Y'all know gopher tortoises? We have gopher tortoises at Wendell Fort Benning. They're really big tortoises. They burrow into sandy environments. The mycoplasmas have devastated the tortoise population. Tortoises that are carrying the infection will go into the burrow and they'll leave the organism in the burrow, so every tortoise that goes in after him will acquire the infection. So that's been devastating to the gopher tortoise population.
That is sad.
I think that's the last one.
You laughed at that. That's sad.
So, any questions? Any questions at all?
So what did you say with ceviche? You said it's not cooked.
It's not good.
So when I tell my brother-in-law
It's
this,
just denaturing the protein.
It denatures the protein and makes it look cooked.
can I get something recorded so I can tell him? I'm be like, you tried to kill us
Now,
all.
it's definitely not cooked.
But you eat
So,
oysters.
if there is-
Yeah, I eat oysters, but I'm complaining about the fish.
Okay.
But
You know, that
it looks like it's
lemon
they
juice is
whatever,
an acid.
and they take
So
the finny thing,
reacts with
and they put all that in
protein, and
there.
it changes
I like
the
it though. I like
structure. So it
kidney.
really does look cooked, but it is not.
I like Jamboree food.
Just that was like, so fish is one of the primary sources of income in Cuba because it's a coastal place in Peru.
Uh-huh.
And you'd be surprised, I mean, I lived there for 2 years and you can't tell anyone that
That's
lime,
not
that
cooked.
lemon in the lime doesn't cook.
Doesn't
It
cook it.
doesn't
Yeah,
cook
that's
it.
the problem.
And it's such a huge thing, so
Yeah.
Maybe that's not the problem, it's good.
Yeah, their stomachs are probably used to it, but if it's one of those more dangerous organisms or parasites, you know, they can get easy. I was really worried about, with fish. There's a parasite called, I think it's in your book. It's
We already did that last week.
Diphilobacterium vagina, and it's in the gut of a fish. And the problem is, when that fish warms up, that worm will crawl out of the gut into the flesh. And then if you consume the flesh of that fish, you're getting that parasite. And that's a real bad one. So that's as long as the fish is cold, it stays in the gut, so it's not a problem. It's only when the fish warms up, if you don't get it on ice immediately, that's when it crawls out into the flesh.
can you cook it all the way through? Like if you cook it, would you kill the?
Oh, yeah, cooking it would kill the parasite or kill any microbes or anything else.
Okay.
So cooking it makes it safe.